Sometimes a single glance says more than a lifetime of words. That evening, when my husband's boss turned to look back before leaving the room, everything I thought I knew about myself shifted, not in scandal or chaos, but in a quiet, undeniable awakening. It wasn't about romance or temptation. It was about being seen, really seen, after years of feeling invisible. And maybe that moment was the beginning of finding myself again. Before I begin, tell me, from which cities are you watching tonight? I love knowing where my stories travel, where your hearts listen from. Now, let me take you back to the night that changed the rhythm of my ordinary life. It was late October, one of those evenings when the wind carries both the scent of rain and the faint ache of memory. Our house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, the kind of place where porch lights glowed like tired lanterns and neighbors nodded more than they spoke. Inside, the dining room flickered with candlelight. My husband, Robert, was pacing nervously, straightening the same stack of napkins for the 5th time. His boss, Dylan Reeves, the man I'd heard about in endless work stories, was coming for dinner. "You know how important tonight is," Robert kept saying, half to himself. "If this merger goes through, it could change everything." I smiled, smoothing the front of my dress, trying to calm him with the same patience I'd used for decades, the quiet, uncredited labor of keeping peace. "It's just dinner," I said gently. "He's not coming to inspect the furniture." But truthfully, I was nervous too. Dylan Reeves wasn't just any boss. He was the kind of name whispered with respect, the company's silent power, known for his precision and restraint. I'd imagined him countless times through Robert's descriptions: sharp, demanding, maybe a little cold. When the doorbell rang, Robert nearly tripped over himself answering it. And then there he was. Dylan stood in the doorway with a composed smile, a dark overcoat draped over one arm, and an expression that carried both authority and a kind of quiet fatigue. His salt and pepper hair was neatly brushed back, a few rebellious strands fallen forward. His eyes were what caught me. Gray, steady, with a depth that suggested he'd seen more than he ever said aloud. "Mr. Reeves," I greeted, offering my hand. "Welcome." "Dylan, please," he said, his voice low and calm. His handshake was firm, his palm warm. For a fraction of a second, I felt a spark, not the kind that burns, but the kind that wakes something forgotten. Dinner was pleasant, almost uneventful at first. The clink of cutlery, polite conversation, a few cautious laughs. Robert spoke mostly about work, eager to impress. I stayed quiet, filling plates, pouring wine, keeping the flow natural. Yet every so often, Dylan's gaze would drift to me, not inappropriately, not lingering, but in a way that acknowledged I was there. Present, not just someone's wife filling the silence. When I mentioned that I'd once worked as a journalist before I decided to stay home and raise our kids, his expression shifted slightly. "You were a journalist?" he asked. "What did you write about?" "Mostly human stories," I said, sitting down finally. "Ordinary people doing extraordinary things." He nodded slowly. "Those are the hardest stories to tell, and the ones that matter most." It wasn't a flirtation. It was recognition. A simple, mutual understanding that words and stories still meant something. The evening wore on easily after that. We shared laughter, and even Robert seemed to relax. Dylan had that rare presence, the kind that filled a room without noise, the kind that made silence comfortable instead of heavy. After dessert, Robert excused himself to take a business call in the other room, leaving the two of us alone at the table. The candles had burned lower, the shadows softer. Dylan glanced around the room, noticing the framed photographs lining the wall. "Your home feels lived in," he said quietly. "That's rare these days." "It's not perfect," I reply, smiling, "but it's ours. Every dent in the wood, every faded curtain. It's all part of the story. He looked at me thoughtfully. You still talk like a writer. The comment caught me off guard. I laughed softly. Old habits die hard. Some habits, he said, his tone gentler now, shouldn't die at all. Something in that moment, the softness of his words, the steadiness in his eyes, reached a place in me I hadn't realized was empty. For years, I'd been the caretaker, the listener, the one who kept the house running quietly behind the scenes. And yet, in that small exchange, I felt seen not as a role, but as a person. When Robert returned, the conversation shifted back to work, numbers, projections, the language of ambition. But I barely heard them. My mind kept circling that one sentence. Some habits shouldn't die at all. Later, when Dylan stood to leave, I walked him to the door out of courtesy. Robert lingered behind, already checking his phone for missed messages. It was a lovely evening, Dylan said, pulling on his coat. You have a gift for creating calm in a room, Amanda. I wasn't sure how to respond. Thank you, I said softly. I'm glad you felt comfortable. He smiled faintly and turned to leave, but just before crossing the threshold, he paused. He looked back, not hurriedly, not with hesitation, but with purpose. Our eyes met, and for that one suspended heartbeat, the air seemed to shift again. There was no scandal in it, no unspoken invitation. It was just awareness. A mutual understanding between two people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be noticed beyond their titles, their routines, their expected roles. Good night, he said, his voice quieter now. Good night, Dylan, I replied. When the door closed, I stood there a moment longer, hand resting on the wood, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade down the walkway. Robert's voice called from the living room, breaking the spell. He liked you, he said lightly, not looking up from his phone. That's a good sign. Is it? I asked, half smiling. He didn't notice the question in my tone. That night, after the dishes were washed and the lights dimmed, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The rain had started again, pattering softly against the window. It wasn't Dylan's glance that kept replaying in my mind. It was what it stirred inside me. A sense of presence I hadn't felt in years. A reminder that beyond the rhythm of everyday life, there were still moments capable of touching something real. I didn't know then that our paths would cross again, unexpectedly, and in ways that would test what I believed about connection, trust, and self-discovery. But that single moment, when my husband's boss looked back before leaving the room, was where it all began. The next morning arrived with the soft percussion of a steady rain, the kind that turns the world quiet enough to hear your own thoughts walking around. I stood at the kitchen sink, hands wrapped around a warm mug, and watched the drops stitch faint circles into the birdbath. I told myself that last night's moment at the door, Dylan turning back, the look that wasn't a question so much as an acknowledgement, would fade like steam on a mirror. But it didn't. It held its shape, not as a threat, not as a secret, but as a reminder that being seen can feel like oxygen after a long climb. By noon, the sky had brightened into a pale, rinsed blue. Robert was already buried in spreadsheets and merger calls in the home office, door hack shut, the way it often was. I made him a sandwich, slid it in without interrupting, then checked my phone. A new email waited from Dylan. The subject line was almost comically plain. Thank you for last night. He'd written that the dinner was kind, the conversation genuine, and then, in a second paragraph, he asked something that made my stomach lift as if the floor had tilted. At the company, he wrote, morale had thinned during the merger talk. People felt like units on a balance sheet instead of lives with birthdays and softball teams and mothers who kept recipes on index cards. He wanted to start a small internal project, short profiles of the people who made the place hum. He'd heard I used to be a journalist. Would I consider helping structure it? Not as a favor, he'd pay a consulting fee, and only if it didn't complicate things at home. He added that last part like a guardrail set down gently. I read it twice, then 3 times. The idea felt right. Human. Useful. But this was my husband's world too. I walked to the office and knocked. Robert waved me in without looking up. "Swamped," he said, then noticed the paper bag. "You're a saint." "Saints don't use store-bought bread," I said, and he smiled, distracted but tender. I told him about the email. His first reaction was purely practical. It could look good if leadership respects you. And then a flicker of something more personal moved across his face and was gone. "If you want to do it, he said. "You were always good at that human stuff." That human stuff. I pretended not to hear the clumsy phrasing. "Only if you're comfortable with it," I said carefully. "I don't want lines blurred." He squeezed my hand, eyes still on his screen. "I trust you. And Dylan's solid. Just keep me in the loop." That night I wrote Dylan back, "I'll help if we keep it simple, transparent, and respectful. Daytime meetings, open doors, and only if Robert is kept informed." He replied within the hour. "Agreed to all of it. Thank you." 2 days later I walked into the company lobby for the first time, the kind of space designed to make big promises. High ceilings, clean angles, a proud wall of photographs showing projects completed, and checks presented to charities. A receptionist named Gloria greeted me like we were already neighbors. "Oh, you're Robert's wife," she said, "and the writing lady." I laughed at that. Some days I'm more the wife than the writing lady. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "You can be both." Dylan met me not with a grand tour, but with 2 cups of coffee and a glass-walled conference room facing the courtyard. He brought a small notebook, old-fashioned, with a cloth cover a little frayed at the corner. "I think we should talk to people who keep the lights on," he said. "Accounting, warehouse, the night crew, the ones who don't show up on PowerPoint slides, but make everything possible." He asked how I liked to work. I told him that people spoke more freely when they were in their own space, or when their hands were busy, stacking invoices, checking inventory, pouring coffee. We made a plan for 3 short interviews a day for the next 2 weeks, nothing intrusive. He listened, asked good questions, and agreed to let me craft the shape of it. "Call it whatever you want," he said. "But I've been thinking about the phrase from your dinner story, about noticing. Maybe it's just look back." Look back. The words sat down next to me like an old friend. "Yes," I said quietly. "That's it." Over the next week, I found my feet in rooms I didn't know I missed. Rooms built by stories. I perched at the edge of cubicles, sat on warehouse pallets, leaned against door frames in the copy room, while outside the late fall light slid down the building like slow honey. I met a woman named Leigh who had started in the mailroom 27 years ago and now ran the department like a steady river. She kept a photo of her father in her top drawer and took it out on hard days, touched his jacket shoulder with her fingertip, then got back to work. I met a forklift operator with a laugh so generous the rafters seemed to hold it for later. He kept a chessboard in his locker and played against himself on breaks so he could keep his mind quick. I met a man in it who repaired laptops with the gentleness of a violin maker. When I asked why, he said, "These computers hold people's work. I don't want to jar it." Every conversation was the same length and a different shape. People relaxed as the minutes passed. It was never a confessional. It was a way of arranging the furniture of a life so the light could find it. I wrote by hand at first, then typed at night, keeping the sentences simple and clean, letting the details do the work. A chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Dad," the habit of straightening a crooked frame every morning, the lunchbox that once belonged to a mother and now belonged to a daughter. Dylan did not hover. He checked in by email or waved from across the hall. When we did meet, doors open, we spoke about arcs and shape and the quiet geometry of attention. He never made suggestions about the people, only about distribution. Maybe 3 profiles a week on the intranet, printed versions posted in the break room, a little binder kept at reception for visitors to flip through as if learning a town. Once, late on a Wednesday, I looked up from my notes and found him standing by the doorway, not coming farther in, one hand on the frame. "Is it what you hoped?" he asked. "It's what I forgot I needed," I said before I could soften it. He nodded just once. Good. At home, the shift in me was small but noticeable. I sang without meaning to while cutting onions, and when Robert asked what tune it was, I said I didn't know, just something the day left on my tongue. He was proud, I think, but there was a new, brittle stamina in his days. The merger had put weight on him. Sometimes he fell asleep on the sofa with his phone slipping to the carpet and the television asking, "Are you still watching?" I tucked a blanket around his shoulders and turned off the screen. The question hung in the air anyway. One evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, he said, too casually, "Dylan told me the pieces are strong." I rinsed a plate. He told me the people are strong. He nodded, not convinced. Same thing. "Not quite," I said gently. A week later, Dylan asked if we could meet at a small cafe near the office to talk about next steps. I told him I'd prefer to meet on site as we'd agreed. He didn't bristle. "Of course," he said. "Thank you for saying what you need." It was a small sentence that reminded me how boundaries, when spoken plainly, can be a kindness to everyone. We began to design a gathering, a simple midday event in the atrium where I would read 2 profiles and the rest would be displayed on easels, printed on sturdy cardstock. Coffee, cookies, and an open invitation. No speeches. Just a chance for people to see each other with softer eyes. I was nervous and said so. "Words out loud are different," I told him. "They're alive," he said. "Let them breathe." On the morning of the event, I stood in front of the mirror and put on a dark green dress I hadn't worn in years. It made my eyes look more certain. Robert tied his tie too tightly, loosened it, then tied it again. "You'll do great," he said, kissing my cheek, a touch both familiar and, if I'm honest, late. I took his hand. "We'll do great," I said, and meant it, even if we weren't entirely on the same page of the same book. The atrium filled, slowly at first, then in a warm swell, warehouse boots squeaking on polished floors, a scatter of blazers, Gloria at the front with a stack of programs she'd made on her lunch break. Dylan moved through the crowd without fanfare, the way some people move through a kitchen at a family reunion, checking the coffee, replacing napkins, making sure the shy ones have a chair. When it was time, he stepped to the side, not the center, and lifted a hand for quiet. "This isn't a ceremony," he said. "It's a moment to look back so we can look better at each other. Amanda has collected pieces of who we are. She's going to let them speak." He looked at me then, and there it was again, an echo of that first night, not an invitation, not a promise, not a spark that asked to burn anything down. It was permission to take up space, to say what I had seen and trust that it would land. I read Lay's story first, then the forklift operators, my voice trembling for 30 seconds, and then finding its level like water in a glass. I watched shoulders loosen. I watched faces change shape. People laughed in a way that carried a small measure of relief. When I finished, there was no applause at first, only the soft sound of everyone exhaling at once. Then a gentle clapping rose and spilled into the room, not loud enough to drown anything else, just enough to hold us together for a moment. Afterward, a man I'd never met pressed a hand to his chest and said, "Thank you for saying who we are." A young woman told me her father worked nights there for 2 decades and would have loved hearing himself in that room. Gloria hugged me and whispered, "You made us look like ourselves." I turned and found Robert standing a little apart, looking at me in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. Pride, yes, but something else, the realization that his story had a co-author again. He came closer and took my hand in front of everyone, not as a performance, but as if remembering where his hand fit. "You were remarkable," he said, and for the first time I believed he heard the weight under the words. I squeezed back. "So are they," I said. Dylan approached then, eyes bright in that unshowy way of his. "You gave us something we didn't know we were missing," he said. "Thank you." He didn't touch my arm. He didn't linger too long. He did what he always did. He listened for what the moment asked of him and offered only that. People drifted toward coffee and cookies. I wandered to the edge of the crowd and looked at the easels, at the paragraphs standing upright in the light. It felt like walking through a garden you'd planted in October and now, against reason, seeing green. Dylan passed behind me on his way to a meeting, and this was the smallest thing. Paused before leaving the atrium, turned and looked back. Not at me only, but at the room as a whole, as if to memorize it. I felt oddly grateful for that. Some rooms deserve to be remembered. At home that night, Robert and I sat at the kitchen table with the window cracked just enough to let the cool in. He reached for my notebook, then stopped. "May I?" he asked. I slid it to him. He read a page, another, and then set it down carefully, as if it were something that could bruise. "I haven't given you enough room," he said. "In my hurry, in my noise, I'm sorry." We didn't fix a marriage in a single conversation. Life almost never allows such clean edits. But we placed a marker there, something to find again when the day scattered us. Over the next weeks we tried small things. Friday walks after dinner, phones at home when we went out for breakfast on Sundays, a question each night not about schedules, but about what startled us, in the world, in a memory, in ourselves. We didn't always manage it, but a path made by feet grows more certain the more you trust it. The project continued. Look Back became a quiet ritual in the building. People brought me names on sticky notes. The CEO asked, half joking, if I would profile him too. I told him to ask Gloria to vouch first. He did. She said he sometimes refilled the candy bowl himself. I wrote it down. When the merger finally closed, the announcement landed like a thunder far from town. The building shook a little but didn't crack. People clustered around the easels as if to steady themselves. It mattered. On my last day of the contract, I stopped by Dylan's office to say thank you. He was packing a briefcase, jacket on the chair back, looking not like a boss but like a man between tasks. We stood by the window and watched a few late leaves skate down the glass. "You gave us more than copy," he said. "You gave us a way to stand together." "You reminded me I still know how to put a hand on the right sentence," I said. We smiled at each other, and whatever had been in that first look, possibility, respect, a quiet yes, glowed for a moment and then settled into its final shape. We both knew what it was and what it wasn't. It wasn't an almost story. It wasn't a hidden room. It was a good door propped open between two people so that air could move through. He walked me to the lobby. Just before the turnstiles, he paused and looked back as if the habit had become a kind of gratitude. I waved. He nodded once and left. The door's side closed behind him in that particular way glass doors do when they mean it. On the drive home, the late afternoon sun glanced off the hood of the car, the way memory glances off old joys. Brief, golden enough. I parked in our drive and sat a minute longer, hands loose on the wheel. A part of me felt finished in the best sense of the word, like a paragraph finding its period after a string of commas. Another part felt newly beginning. I walked inside. Robert was at the stove stirring a pot, humming something off-key and earnest. He had cut carrots in uneven coins, and the kitchen smelled like a promise a family makes to itself on a Tuesday. He handed me the spoon. "Taste," he said. I did. It was a little too salty. Or maybe it wasn't. I set the spoon down, stepped closer, and pressed my cheek against his shoulder. "It's good," I said. "Let's let it simmer." Later, when the house had settled and the news had mumbled itself to sleep, I opened my notebook and wrote a sentence I wanted to remember. Sometimes the most faithful part of a story is the moment someone looks back, not to go where they shouldn't, but to honor where they've been. Then I turned off the lamp and let the dark be soft around us. The rain returned in the early hours, tapping the window like a polite guest who knows the way in. I woke and thought of the atrium, the easels, Gloria's stack of programs, Robert's hand finding mine, Dylan's last glance that blessed a room and then let it go. I thought of how attention, given freely, changes the math of a day. And I understood that what happened to me was not a cliff or a flame. It was a window opening. It was air. In the morning, I would start a small column for the community newsletter, short pieces about the people who make our town move in ordinary, extraordinary ways. I would ask better questions at dinner. I would say a clearer kind of yes and a kinder kind of no. I would practice the habit that shouldn't die at all, noticing. That was the whole of it. Unexpected, consensual, deeply felt, and most surprising of all, steady. No fireworks required, just a look that helped me find my own eyes in the mirror again, and a life willing to grow around that truth.